We are so honored to have one of the Milwaukee area's own, Willa C Richards, graduate of the IR Writers Workshop, and also, most importantly, the UWM Creative Writing Program PhD degree. She also went to Brookfield East, so I should say that. Another shout out to a school district that we love working with. Her writing has appeared in the Paris Review. She's the recipient of a Penn Robert J. Dow Prize for Emerging Writers. I just want to say a little about her new debut novel, The Comfort of Monsters, which I first heard about from her conversation partner, Valerie Laken, who told me how much she loved it. Valerie's an associate professor of English at UWM and the author of Dream House and Separate Kingdom. Sarah Wyman in the New York Times wrote, novels that explore the effect and aftermath of serial murder, especially over the course of decades, always capture my interest. Willa C Richards' debut, The Comfort of Monsters, is a particularly impressive example, setting its layered narrative of sisterhood, tough upbringings, violence, and grief against the backdrop of what happened in Milwaukee during the summer of 1991, when the city reeled after Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested for killing a number of young men. And I also want to note Jung Yeon in the Los Angeles Review of Books called the new book an intense and artful examination of the relationships between sex, power, violence, and identity, as well as the deeply subjective nature of human memory, a bravura performance by Richards that should demand readers' attention. I'm so happy to have you both here. Welcome to the Boswell Virtual Event Series, wherever you may be. Thank you so much, both of you.
Yeah, welcome everybody. I just want to say congratulations to you, Willa, for the launch of this book, which is so beautiful. And I feel so lucky to have been able to read a few early drafts of it while you were still a student. And I was blown away by it from the very beginning. And it's really so fun and gratifying for me to see it, you know, coming out and on bookshelves and to get to do this with you tonight. So thanks for doing this. I think it would be great if you could maybe just tell us a little bit about the book from your point of view, and then maybe read a little for us. And then I have some questions too.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. And I just want to say before we sort of get started, thank you so much to Daniel and to Boswell's. And then, you know, this is my first event, so I'm very excited and just really happy to be sort of back in Milwaukee and enjoying the city and enjoying launching my novel here, which is really means a lot to me. And then huge thank you to you, Valerie, for, you know, sort of launching the very early version of this book into its current form, because I couldn't have done it without you. And so it is also very gratifying to be sort of, you know, come full circle with it. So thank you so much for doing this tonight. So the Comfort of Monsters is really, for me, the story of Peg McBride, who's the narrator. And she loses her sister during the summer of 1991. She's very, very close to her sister. And half of the book is set in 91, half of the book is set in 2019. And the 2019 sections are sort of her looking back on the summer of 91, which was also, as you know, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about tonight, the summer that the Milwaukee police discovered Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes. So in 2019 is she's sort of looking back and trying to really curate, remember, understand what happened. And I would say that's sort of the core of the book, is her investigation of her own memories. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit. It's very short, and yes, we're going to keep on time for sure to make it to the Bucks game, because my parents are downstairs and they're anxious about that. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit. And it's from right at the beginning. And again, the narrator is Peg McBride. I'm somewhat embarrassed to admit that a few years ago, I became emboldened when the Me Too movement picked up steam and everyone started saying they were going to believe women. Excellent, I remember thinking. I waited for Gary Walski Jr., the MPD detective who had been assigned to Dee's case 28 years ago, to call and say, let's hear your story. I waited for the MPD to call and say, we're sorry we didn't believe you before, but we're listening now. I waited for the Journal Sentinel, for BuzzFeed, for anyone to call and say, let us help you tell your story. No one called, no one checked in. I reorganized my files for the 600th time. Finally, against my better judgment, I called Walski. He picked up immediately. "Oh, Christ, Margaret, I thought you might call," he said, sighing. "I'm sorry." My heart leapt. An apology. "Should I come into your office now? I have tapes in the files, or I can fax everything." No, 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 he said. "That won't be necessary. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened between us." Between us. Yeah, I know now it wasn't right. I paused. I recalibrated. "I'm not calling about that." "Oh." He breathed a quiet and incriminating sigh of relief. "I thought you were going to Me Too me." "Should I?" I asked him sharply. We'd slept together once, a very long time ago, when I was in a bad way. I blamed him, of course, but I blamed myself more. He didn't take the bait. "Why did you call then?" he asked. He suddenly sounded bored and eager to hang up. I was disoriented. "I thought maybe with the climate and everything," I said, "maybe you guys could take another look at my testimony, my evidence." There was a long pause. I held my breath, and then I hung up on him. I didn't need to hear what he was about to say because I'd heard it too many times before. No body, no crime.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I found myself so intrigued by this title, and I was wondering if you could talk. Also, I just want to say to everybody who's here, I have a set of questions to ask Willa, and we'll just kind of veer into some hopefully semi-natural conversation about the book. But also, if you guys, we will have time in the last 10 minutes or so. If you want to ask questions, you'll be able to do that. I think in the chat space is the best way to do it. So if questions occur to you while you're listening to this, you can type them into the chat space, and we will scroll up and find them toward the end of this. But I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit, Willa, about the title of the book, how you chose this one, whether it had earlier titles, and how you feel like this title kind of crystallizes what the book means to you.
Yeah, that's great. Not a lot of people have asked me about the title, and it came to me late. I had probably, I worked on the book for about 5 years, and I had a lot of working titles. My agent will tell you that. But I came to this one through a Jack Halberstam essay that actually was about Silence of the Lambs, but also Jeffrey Dahmer. And it was a very, very interesting essay to me as it pertained to my research. But, one of the things that, and it's from the epigraph in the book, but this idea that we really, like scapegoats, right? And it's very easy to create some big monstrous X, Y, and Z to sort of put all of our problems on and say, okay, well, A, that's not us. And then also, we're safe. We don't have anything to do with that. That's the problem. And I think I really wanted, not just as it relates to Dahmer, but also as it relates to like everyone, and to be sort of like looking inward at their own place within these institutions, and kind of how it's inescapable. And I think that's where I thought the comfort of monsters was such a perfect sort of phrase, because it's very comforting to believe that, we're not sort of complicit in all of these institutions, and we're not involved in them. It's someone else's problem. It's someone else's, issue to deal with, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Were there earlier titles or different titles that you kicked around?
Yeah, there were a lot of them, but I think they were so bad. I don't even remember them. I'm not good at titles, but I will say that when I chose this one, both my husband and my agent, they were just like, absolutely, yes. So I was like, well, okay. But I can't even remember. I who would? My sister. She's read every single iteration of the book. She would probably remember some of the older titles.
Cool. I guess I have my questions like in a certain order, but now that we've had this bit of conversation, maybe I'll kind of scramble the order a bit. It's a book that has, from what you read and how you described it, there's a fair amount of violence in the book, not gratuitous, not graphic, but it's kind of lurking around every corner and in sometimes surprising ways. I'm wondering if did you always know that the book would contain this much violence, or did it kind of bloom out of the Dahmer stuff and the disappearance of the sister, like, did you, I found myself kind of wondering whether, as a writer, if we have one big kind of violent act, or, you know, some really dramatic violence as a part of the storyline, does that
Mhm.
kind of either pave the way or even maybe necessitate more violence to be threaded throughout the book to kind of balance it out or create a context for it? I'm wondering.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think, you know, the book started as a short story, and this will be a spoiler-free night, but there's a part of the book that you know, used to be sort of right near the end of the short story. And it's a pretty intense moment of violence. And I think that little crucible sort of was, or like you sort of the word bloom, like that was the moment that I think a lot of the rest of the violence started to you know, started to bloom from that particular sort of like seed. And then, but I think with the Dahmer stuff, I wanted, you know, I did want to sort of like juxtapose these different forms of violence against one another, and see what kinds of visions came out of that, in terms of like, oh, okay, well, we have a lot of, you know, media portrayals of the Dahmer sort of violence, which seemed so horrific as to be like from another planet, right? But then to layer that on these more like interpersonal moments, that was very interesting to me. So I think that's why I kind of kept doing it. And it sort of just repeated itself a little bit over the book. So I think you're right to sort of pull that out. And it definitely was something I was interested in exploring.
Yeah, I feel like, and I wish that I had a better memory too of how the book evolved, but I feel like it has become just a little more violent over the years, in a good way. Like, I find the violence really affecting and really unsettling in really beautiful, interesting ways, because it's never just one emotion. It's never just like, you know, you give us something, some kind of piece of ugly violence, and we're allowed to just feel clear about what it means, and to recognize that
Right.
it's 100% bad and off limits. There's always this very, I don't want to spoil anything for readers, but there's a lot of nuance to the way that you depict violence, and a lot of you know, ways that you incorporate violence into relationships, into romantic exchanges, into sex, into all this stuff that is very unsettling, and even the characters themselves aren't sure how they feel about it or what to make of it, what it means to them. And that's just really beautifully done, and I feel like it's something that we don't see enough of on the page. So I just, to me, like, that's one of the real achievements of this book, and one of the things that I really relished when I was reading it. I don't read a lot of like, I don't gravitate toward violence in film,
Sure.
or in books, and I, you know, generally don't even like it much. But I thought you handled it so deftly, because I think partly because the prose is so poetic and so nuanced that it never feels like you're, you know, kind of like shoving our face in it. It's like you always find a really artful way to incorporate it into these scenes, and I find that to be really distinctive about your book, and I just wanted to say that.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's a huge compliment, especially since it was something that I worked a lot on. And in, as you know, like multiple drafts, sort of thinking about this and thinking about what I want to do with it. And it's funny that you say, you know, you don't gravitate towards violence too, because, you know, I'm a huge baby to on-screen violence. Like, I'm still like the, you know, shield my eyes from everything. And so I do also find it very interesting that I write about it a lot. But I think it is because, you know, you pulled out that thread of like the characters constantly trying to assess and like put it on that spectrum of like, is this good, is this bad, how should I feel about it? And I think I wanted the reader to have that experience too, because I think, yeah, there's a lot, especially, you know, with the Dahmer crimes, it's like, okay, well, that's so clearly bad, right? Bad. But there's like this whole like gradation spectrum of violence, and I think I wanted to show that in the book very much, like not just this sort of like crazy apex, but to have that layer of the spectrum sort of in the backdrop always. But I also like, I very much enjoy, which I don't think my book does, but I do enjoy like the threat of violence a lot in novels. Like I remember I read The Road. Like that book has just such an amazing, you're constant, like there isn't a lot of very graphic sort of violence happening, but you're constantly sort of like, oh my God, something terrible is definitely going to happen. And sometimes I think that's more satisfying than actually like showing it. So I was playing a little bit with that, but I think mine is a lot more graphic at times.
In snippets, like I don't want anybody to, to kind of like,
Yeah, I know.
I think that it's handled really well. It doesn't feel, over the top or gratuitous. It actually makes me think about how much in this final version, I feel like, the book really reminds me, it calls to mind film noir a lot. And I mean that as praise. We don't, like I started to think about, like a year or two ago, there was that book Milwaukee Noir that came out, they did a noir series for every city. And I wrote something for it, and I I just said yes because, I said yes. And then I had to think like, well, what is noir and how am I going to write a noir story? And, when you start to look it up and study it, like so many of the elements that are classic noir elements are in this book. I mean, we have, someone solving a dark mystery in a dangerous, seedy city. We have all the atmospheric elements associated with noir, but especially that like really pervasive sense of anxiety and cynicism that like no matter what leaf we turn over, it's going to be something unsavory under there. Like there's never like one good knight in shining armor. There's no kind of real hope. There's a real sense that like the environment that you've created for this story or for this novel is like everywhere you turn, there's something a little bit corrupted, a little bit off, a little bit unpleasant going on. And that just makes me as a reader feel so unsettled and uneasy and like anxious about what's going to come. And that creates this kind of really page turning sensation for the reader. I think it's just like a really juicy environment to spend time in. But I was just curious that like, was that something that was on your mind? Like, do you have a penchant for noir? Was it something that you recognized you were doing or have thought about over time? Or do you feel like, no, that's just not even something that you had in mind doing this?
I mean, not specifically noir. I definitely, I agree with everything that you sort of listed there. But I will say detective fiction, mystery, thriller, like I read a lot of that stuff when I was really little. And I think it was all like, they were always sort of my favorite books to just fly through. And so I think when I did sit down and write this book, whether I knew it consciously or not at the time, was pulling out, these threads, like what are the detective, the detective tropes, what are the police tropes, the journalist tropes, all this stuff. So I think those sort of things definitely, came through. And then I think in later drafts, I was like, okay, so now I've used some of them. Now I'll try to, change them a little bit or make things a little bit, just turn things on their head a touch here and there. But that stuff came a lot later. It wasn't really in the drafting phase, I guess.
I think that, and I think there's a way in which like crime fiction versus noir, I think that noir has a little bit more space for the kind of character development and like depth of meaning that you've got going on in this book. And that's really fun. And I think obviously that has something to do also with the way that you chose to structure it. It's a book that goes back and forth in time, as you said, like between 1991 when Dee disappears and 2019 when the family hires a psychic to try to find her remains. And so there is this mystery at the core, like she's still missing and they're trying to find the body, and and Peg is trying to find out for sure who did this. But, like a different writer, like a purely crime fiction writer might have just focused the story in 1991 with the disappearance. And you have that great backdrop of the Dahmer story playing out in the background. So, and I think that your choice to incorporate both time periods and this larger swath of time does a lot of different things for the book. I was wondering if you could talk about like what to you is essential about extending this story by 28 years and having both of those time periods play into the book as a whole? What were you able to do on this broader canvas that you wouldn't have been able to do if you just kept the story in or around 1991?
Yeah. So the 2019 section was always a part of the novel for me from the very beginning. I did write all of the 91 stuff first, and then I had a very difficult task of sitting down to write the 2019, and originally they were going to be two separate halves of a book. And you know, the 2019 section was so crucial for me because I really wanted to, in that section, do the work of, you know, sort of exploring memory, you know, thinking about how these stories become truth to us. And I felt like if I stayed in the 91 section, I wouldn't really be able to do that work. And I also, from a very, very early draft of the book, I was very intent on juxtaposing what a psychic might say happened to Dee with what Peg believed very strongly had happened that summer. And so I felt like without that distance, you wouldn't have those questions of well, I mean, it's been 30 years. Like, do you really remember if it had, you know, if they'd had the psychic 5 years later or something? I think setting it so much, you know, further into the future was really important to me to be able to explore those, you know, those issues of the fallibility of memory. And yeah, what was the other part of the question?
No, I got it. But yeah,
okay.
could you talk a little bit more about memory and storytelling, either broadly or in terms of what you're doing in the book?
Yeah. Well, okay, so it was funny too, right? So when I was at UWM, one of my first classes was with Liam. And he had us read, I think this is what it's called, The Albanian Virgin, the Alice Munro story. It's a very long short story, which is my perfect length for short stories. But it was, yeah, I had never read it before. That was my first time reading it. I became very obsessed with it. And I read it at the same time that I was starting the 2019 sections. And I was very anxious about those sections because it was it was an older voice. I really wanted to be careful with Peg's grief and like what her grief would look like on the page, and how, and what she would sort of like, what place she would be in at that time. So that story really sort of just like excited me to really dig into memory and to think about like different ways of just like meta narrative and storytelling about storytelling, which I feel like all writers are just like secretly or not so secretly obsessed with. But it was really that sort of spark that I think made me really want to center the 2019 stuff sort of on her. Okay, I really believe this is what happened, and then sort of over the course of the 2019 sections becoming more and more destabilized in those beliefs about what happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you think, well, you mentioned the psychic, and I know that we had conversations earlier. I think maybe you once said, and forgive me if I'm misremembering, but I feel like maybe you once said that your agent or editor wasn't sure about whether to include the psychic. And it seems to me like a bit of like there's this line early on in the book where I think Peg says something, and maybe you even read it. She says something about like, we wouldn't have been the kind of family who would hire a psychic, but you get into this position, and over time, anything can make you, it'll change you. And I was just curious about like how I love the way that the psychic is portrayed. I mean, he's just such a unique character, and he's so strange, and there's something so weirdly childlike about him. I know he's young, but he's not a child, but he does sometimes have these weird, like creepily childlike qualities. And in a book that is so cynical, I thought it was really interesting for you to put so much pressure on this experience with the psychic, because it's not just one encounter, it's like a series of planned encounters, and there's a lot riding on it, and there's a lot that their family is paying to him for it. And so I was just wondering if you could talk about how he came into the book, Thomas Alexander, and how you decided to portray him, and whether there, whether you toyed with not using him, or what he does for the book that you needed.
Yeah, he was, well, there was always a psychic in the short story version. In the very original version, there was always a psychic. Like I said, that was one of the original juxtapositions I wanted to have. I wanted to have a psychic say, this is what I think happened, and for Peg to be like, boy, whoa, no. But there were a lot of iterations of the character. I think the very first one was a woman, and it changed a lot. I think one thing that was really hard for me, and I worked on, and I might have even talked to you a little bit about this, Valerie, was, I think Peg's sort of skepticism and cynicism towards him in earlier drafts was, it just wasn't quite right. It wasn't quite working. And so I think what I wanted to do, especially like thinking about the family's grief and about their, their loss, was to make sure that, they were shown like compassionately, but, also it was obvious that they very much still had hope that this person could tell them what would happen. And I think that changed a lot. In earlier drafts, Peg didn't believe in the psychic, didn't think it was going to work at all. And I think those were the drafts that my agent was like, I'm not quite sure, because if she doesn't believe in this at all, like what's sort of the point of it, right? Why is she, invested? And so I think, as I was drafting, I definitely sort of changed Peg to, have that skepticism a little bit at the beginning, but she slowly becomes more and more engaged, more and more hopeful, as does the whole family, that they'll find out what happens from this particular psychic. And I think that was important to me to show too, because I think a lot of us do have that sort of like cool sort of sarcasm surrounding the psychic industry. And that's sort of a place of privilege for some people when, they haven't experienced such a loss like that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the role of Milwaukee in this book, because it might be the most Milwaukee book I've ever read. And I really love that about it. And I think this particular audience probably would too. Excuse me. I mean, one of the funnest things about reading the book is just all the super like specific Milwaukee references, not just Jeffrey Dahmer and Lake Michigan, but like lots of granular details like that only Milwaukee natives would really know, like Kopp's Frozen Custard and the Mount Mary's dorms and certain bars on the South Side, the feel and the status of places like River West and Tosa, the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, like the smell of it in the air of so much of this book. I love the way that you incorporate these references as if the reader is an insider of Milwaukee, which is something that I think that we don't usually see when it comes to smaller cities or places that are not major world capitals like, New York or Paris. When people write about New York, they always just assume that everybody knows what's on the corner of 58th and whatever, like we're supposed to all know this stuff, and people get to write about those places as if everybody knows. And I love that you kind of do that for Milwaukee. Like you explain it enough that an outsider could understand, but you really fold it in as if the reader is a member of this community. And I think that's super fun and also kind of a little bit bold. I like it. I mean, I'm curious whether any editors kind of pushed back and encouraged you to like, explain things more, or could you talk about like your intentions in doing that and why this, why this particular approach and why this city?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I had never, this might just be me being generally poorly read, but I had never read a novel set in Milwaukee before. So I was like, I really wanted to do that. which makes me sound a little egotistical, but yeah, I wanted to see Milwaukee on the page very much. And so I think I don't know, it's funny, I didn't think of any of that going into it, of like, oh, I guess people won't know this or they won't know that. And to be honest, like most of my readers, I would, give to different friends and stuff, to be like, more Milwaukee. If you could just like add in a little bit more Milwaukee, like here, there. And that wasn't even Milwaukee people saying that. It was, like friends from Iowa and stuff too. So I think every draft, I would just kind of like slip in more and more details. I think even from the last draft you read, Valerie, I've added a couple of different, like there's a couple more scenes in Tosa and just different things here and there. So honestly, it was just a lot of fun for me. It was a lot of fun to write about the different places. And, these are all places I grew up, around and spent a lot of time in, especially like in and around the UWM campus and the lakefront. So I think it was just kind of a labor of love, which I know is somewhat awkward since I also set the book in a very fraught time. But for me, I think it was just really, really fun to slip in all of these things that, yeah, were just sort of like part of my childhood, really.
Did you find it easier to write about Milwaukee when you're in Milwaukee or when you're not in Milwaukee? Because there's sometimes you have to be away from a place to I don't know, to relish and fill up all the memories.
Yeah, I had a couple of friends that they were like, oh, don't go and do the PhD. Like, you will never be able to write the book there. You'll never be able to write a book about Milwaukee when you're there. I had a couple of friends that said that, but I found it very invigorating to be back in the city. I was working a lot, teaching a lot, taking classes. I was very busy. I was, spending a lot of time in the city. And I thought it was great. I was able to, I drafted a lot of the book while I was there. And I found it pretty easy to write the book while I was there, but I wrote about half of it when I wasn't there too. So I guess it was about 50-50.
Mm-hmm. All right. I want to talk a little bit about the sisterhood at the core of this book. I think, probably the most important relationship at the heart of the book is the sisterhood between Peg and Dee. And I think that bond between them is so gorgeously illustrated throughout the book. And in many ways, it feels like potentially the only healthy relationship in the book. That's debatable, but that would be an interesting book club question, I think. But there are a lot of different scenes where you kind of put them in these like you put them in these positions where it kind of echoes a romantic relationship. Like and I don't mean to say anything, anything creepy is going on, but they're often like very tender with each other physically and verbally. They're often falling asleep in each other's arms, professing their love to each other. And, in some ways this is like, it feels like Peg's loss is the loss of her one great love. There's a line somewhere where she says she never would love anybody else like that. And that's not just her as a young person thinking that, it's her as a middle-aged woman knowing that. I was wondering if you could talk about that relationship and what your goals were for it, and whether it was easy or hard to write, and whether there were other models that you looked toward in writing it.
Yeah, I mean, I have a big family. I have 3 sisters, and my youngest sister and I, we grew up very, very close. We're still very close. And when I sat down to write the book, and I was thinking about someone losing their sister at that age, it was hard. It was really, really hard. And I think, one of the things that I wanted to explore was in some way like the loss that almost like for Peg begins before Dee disappears. And this way that like the girls are so like close, sort of like physically, emotionally, when they're very young. And then it's like, there's a point when you hit puberty and you sort of like have that fissure. It's like a natural thing, it happens. But there's like a real pain to me that comes with like, I think just naturally growing up, and there's sort of something that's like lost almost in that relationship, in that closeness. And so part of what I wanted to do was to show like Peg just always sort of wanting to get that back. And like, as that, especially like having like a physical, intimate relationship with someone that like is so safe, that feels very safe. Like there's, zero like threats. There's, it's just pure sort of like, this feels good, we're together, right? And yeah, I think, again, I have gotten some questions from people that are like, oh, it's like a little bit sensual. And like, I don't think that's like wrong to say, but I definitely wanted to show, I don't think it's portrayed all that often. Like, and when it is, people, I think they get a little sticky about it. They're like, oh, I don't know, is this like, how should we label this? What is it? Right. And so I think that was definitely something I wanted to do with their relationship, was to show that sort of like extreme closeness, but also like Peg really grasping onto it as she got older. And I think that also being, another reason that the disappearance became so painful to her too, because she was sort of like already feeling this loss of her sister. I don't know if any of that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny when you were talking, you said something about how it's, that the relationship between them is safe. And it is, which isn't to say that it's not complicated. But it's interesting to me that I think virtually all of the romantic relationships in the book are not safe, are dangerous in some various ways. And I'm wondering whether that was always the case, or whether you got onto a thread and then realized, oh yeah, I think they all have to be. Or were you even aware of that?
No, I wasn't aware of it. I think especially like kind of going back to the title, like The Comfort of Monsters, I really wanted to like, I wanted Peg in the 1991 sections to be like looking at Dee's relationship and being like, oh no, like I see that's wrong, right? But like not really fully able to look inwards or look at her own relationship and sort of see some of the more dangerous or unhealthy aspects of it. And I think that was what sort of led me to explore a little bit more of like, the Peg and Leaf's relationship, and to sort of like juxtapose that against Dee and Frank's relationship.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. Another thing that I think is really successful in the book is that you have not a lot, I shouldn't say that at all. You have a few really great, really beautifully drawn, really well written, really dramatic sex scenes, which everybody, it's notoriously I think it's difficult. A lot of writers think it's really difficult to write sex scenes. There's always this slightly uncomfortable sensation that you're not sure how it's going to land. The language is tricky. And I think that, you have just I don't want to say like a lot, but there's a few really pivotal, really important, really gorgeously crafted and dramatic sex scenes. I was wondering if you could talk about the process of writing them, whether you found them difficult, whether there were writers that you looked toward, or things that you knew going into this that you had to have them there.
Yeah, I don't know what it says about me, but they were not hard to write. Also, I was gonna make a joke at the beginning that I was gonna read a sex scene, but my nephew he's probably not watching anymore because we're like, almost done with it. But yeah, I didn't have a very hard time writing them. I like a lot of my short fiction, especially at Iowa, would have like one really weird big sex scene, and for some reason it would always be the scene that like whoever was leading the workshop would be like, okay, so Willa, would you read that scene? I would be like, of course. So yeah, so it was, I think in writing them, like another writer that was at the workshop with me, Garth Greenwell, I love the way he writes sex, and I definitely looked to his writing. I mean, he's a much different writer than me, but I feel like he's another person that just does it so just so beautifully, and it's graphic, but it never feels like gratuitous, which I find very impressive. That's a very hard balance, and so I definitely looked to his short stories, and he was in one of the workshops where the story was workshopped. So I also got some advice from him, which was really great. And what were the other questions about this?
It's funny because
I
actually,
forgot
like,
already.
underneath this question, I actually had this quote from Garth Greenwell that I was going to ask if you would have any thoughts on. Could I read you this quote from
Yeah,
him?
yeah.
So this is from an essay by Garth Greenwell called "The Joy of Writing About Sex." It's from here. I'm just going to copy the link and put it in the chat space in case people want it later. It's from The Guardian, and I heard him give this as a craft talk a couple years ago, and it blew everybody away. I think and I think that he's really beautifully like this hits on what you achieve in the book, and I'm just curious if you have thoughts about this and how it relates to your book or your goals as a writer. So he said, sex is a uniquely useful tool for a writer, a powerful means not just of revealing character or exploring relationships, but of asking the largest questions about human beings. Sex is an experience of intense vulnerability, and it is also where we are at our most performative. And so it's at once as near to and as far from authenticity as we come. Nothing exposes us more, not just physically, though that's not insignificant, but also morally. Nowhere am I more aware of selfishness and generosity, cruelty and tenderness, daring and failure of nerve in my partners and in myself than in sex.
Yeah, he's an amazing writer. But yeah, I think I remember one of the things that he said that I felt was true about the particular scene that was in the short story and ended up in the book was, he was talking about sex scenes where, and also sex and drugs together, which Liam says can never be in his students' short stories, but he made some exceptions, I guess. But yeah, so he was saying that they sort of, he doesn't like it when they're sort of used to create some type of, moment where a character is acting like completely erratic and like, totally outside of this was one of your phrases, Valerie, of like the zones of their possibility, like, how they would normally act. And he says that he likes it to be sort of like, it just sort of like reveals what we already know to be true about a person, but what they sometimes are like keeping down here, they're keeping it very tamped down. And so, one of the scenes in the book, he sort of talked a little bit about that, where I think both for Peg and Leaf, it was like this moment that they were performing, I think would be a good word, something that had been sort of like floated in their relationship, but had never really like happened. And it happened in that particular scene. And also Dee was there, so it was like there was an extra performative aspect to it. And I thought that was definitely, like, I didn't write that scene going into it like, oh, that's what I'm doing. But then once I wrote it, I was like, oh, yep, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's well put. Thank you. I have one last question, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. My question is, are you, you're probably familiar, Zadie Smith has this essay called That Crafty Feeling, where she argues that novelists are either micromanagers who like start with a great line or a phrase or an image, and then they just accrue a beautiful novel slowly out of it and just go forward. They perfect every line before they go to the next one or the next page. Or they are macro planners who like outline everything and know how the book is going to be shaped and how it's going to end before they start getting to the nitty gritty of how everything should be phrased and staged. I tend to think it's more of a spectrum, but I'm curious, where do you put yourself on that spectrum? Are you more of a micromanager or more of a macro planner, and why?
I think that when it comes to, like, I wrote this off of like a scene that I had in my head, and then it sort of bloomed around there. But I will say that as like a drafting and in my generating phase, I'm definitely macro. I love storyboarding. I like to just do character sketches. I think that if I don't do that stuff, I get like, if I were to do this sort of line by line, like really careful thing, I don't think I would have ever finished the book. I think I would just get way too bogged down, page by page. So I'm definitely like, get a draft out, figure, have the micro plan, get a draft out, and then we can do sort of the finicky stuff later. Especially because I noticed that like I would get very attached to these passages, and then once I was like finished with a draft, I would be like, well, that doesn't fit in here anywhere. So I just spent like 3 days workshopping that paragraph, and now I can't even use it. I have a whole folder of things that didn't end up in the book, which I'm sure is very like normal. But
do you think you'll ever do something else with them, or they're just gonna, happily?
I don't think so. I remember you were saying that one of your friends had like burned a bunch of their notebooks or something, but mine's all on the computer. So I don't know, you just delete them or something. I
don't know. I think you just let them lie there.
Yeah, that's the right move for sure.
So I think if you guys have questions, I think you can either put them in the chat space, or something just popped up as a Q&A as well. So I see a question from Sheila Reynolds that says, did you talk to any families who lost someone to violence to inform your writing, or was it all creative work?
That's a good question. I think a lot of my research was reading. It was definitely, reading a lot of the reporting from the time, reading a lot of like oral histories. I don't think I talked to any specific families or loved ones.
Mm-hmm. I see another question from Cassandra Cosette. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Hi, Cassie.
Cassie, who says, to capture the feelings and memories of Milwaukee in 1991, how did you go about researching that time and the emotions that ran through the town? And did your own childhood in Milwaukee in the 90s color your writing?
Yeah, I've gotten some questions about that. I think it was actually helpful that I wasn't, I was like 1 or something at the time. So I didn't have a lot of memories of that specific summer. So I think when I went back to the research, to the reporting, I was really hungry, and I really like was able to sort of go at it with, I didn't have any preconceived notions or anything like that. So I don't think it was like a lot of sort of childhood memories. I just sort of went to the research and used that. But definitely when it came to like using some of the more Milwaukee stuff, I just drew on what, the places that I spent a lot of time growing up. If that's answering the question.
Yes.
Okay.
I see a question from Bobby Lewis, who says, one aspect of the book is murder mystery, a genre where the reader is guided by evidence and perspectives of the characters. Can you talk more about the meta of writing a mystery and managing to steer your audience without overt exposition?
Oh, hi, Bobby. So yeah, I mean, I think that was actually something I had to do in like later drafts. It was something that I kind of just, tinkered with draft by draft, because it is really hard. Like, and then especially when I wrote the 91 sections first, and I read and the 2019 sections after, and then I had to weave them together. And so I think that was sort of one of the hard parts of like remembering what sort of things I'd already told the reader about in the 91 sections, and then making sure that I wasn't, reintroducing characters or reintroducing even small details, those sort of things twice. And that stuff was kind of hard. And I think when it came to the mystery aspect, I don't know. I don't think I like wrote it as a straight mystery. So I don't think I necessarily like was dropping little, clues in or anything like that. So I don't think I did a whole lot of that. If that answers your question, Bobby.
Mm-hmm. Good. We have a question from John Thurgood, who says, hi, Willa. I was wondering how The Comfort of Monsters is a product of all your writing prior. Do you remember your early writings? Are there any similarities, or can you think of any through lines from your younger self as a writer and this novel? That's a good question.
That is a very good question. I think, I wrote a lot of my first fiction. Well, my very early fiction was science fiction, was just like little fun things. I don't really remember much about it. And then sort of like when I started writing short stories, it was a lot about archaeology, because my parents are both archaeologists. And I think I I probably have like a collection's worth of short stories that are either about archaeologists or, you know, from an archaeologist's point of view. And so I think that's really like the only small through line that I can really think of is there is an archaeologist in this book. And then I guess also I did, when I was younger, I wrote a story about being a child and losing a family member. And I think that would be another through line as well. That was a short story I wrote when I was a undergraduate at UW Madison.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Carol Casaurus says, were there any special teachers who ignited your love of writing?
Hi, Mrs. Casaurus.
Oh my gosh, you think they're yours? Oh, yeah. That's so sweet.
That's awesome that you're here. And yeah, definitely English, freshman English. That was awesome. I don't remember the first paragraph of A Tale of Two Cities though. So I'm really sorry about that. I know we were like supposed to remember that. But I did memorize it at one point. Yeah, I mean, Brookfield East, I had some amazing teachers, Mrs. Casaurus, Mr. Ortman, Mr. Coffey, Ms. Hartford. I had amazing teachers. Also shout out to Miss P. I don't know if she's here tonight, but she was my orchestra teacher. Yeah, so it was I was very lucky. My high school education was excellent. And then I had a lot of really great writing teachers at UW Madison, Judith Mitchell, Kai Carlson Wee, Ahmad Johnson, and then Iowa, a billion, so many. I don't think I should name all of them. I don't know. They're in the book. And then Valerie. And then there was Valerie.
And Liam and so on. Yeah.
And Liam, yes. And Liam.
Christy Clancy has asked, hi, Christy, what sort of feedback did you get about your manuscript when you were at Iowa? I don't know if you were working on this early enough then. I know there was just the story, but in general, like what kind of, you know, some writers, especially because you must have been pretty young when you went to Iowa, because you're still quite young and that was a while ago. But, you know, like some people have like a rocky ride in their MFA experience and some people have a smooth sailing. Did you have any notable things that you could share that you know, any moments of like real acceptance or discomfort?
Yeah, it was all of the above. It was a great time. I was there when I was like 22, 23. And I think it was both good and bad. I didn't have a manuscript at the time. I had no writing. I had nothing. I didn't know what I was doing with my writing at all, which was, again, both good and bad. I think, and I was with like a lot of really accomplished people. So it was very intimidating. And a lot of people had books already, like when I had gotten there. I think Garth was probably almost done with his at that point. I know he sold it in our second year. So it was very intimidating. And, you know, the Iowa model is still the Iowa model. Not all of them were super harsh, but there were definitely some where, you know, you left kind of feeling like your tail between your legs. Like, I don't know that this is for me. But for the most part, like, especially my cohort was just so awesome. And I felt very lucky to be there with the specific people that I was in workshop with. So that was just, I mean, it was a really incredible experience all the way around. And then, yeah, as far as this specific, I didn't start this book. I mean, it was a story that I wrote for like my very last workshop. So I didn't start it until the end of my time there. And then I was working on it when I was doing my third year, like teaching.
Cool. I think we have time for maybe one last question, and this is a good one from Morgan Foster. It's a good one to end on, I mean. Morgan Foster says, hi, Willa, congrats on the book. I'm just wondering what's next. Will you continue writing detective/mystery fiction or move to something else?
Definitely fiction. I'm going to keep writing fiction. That much I can say confidently, but I'm not totally sure for the next book. You know, I think definitely a break from, I think both serial murder and murders in general is in the cards for me.
Yeah, was it hard? Like, was it heavy at times to like go into this book when how dark it can be?
Yeah, it really was. I mean, and it was 5 years of it, you know, and I think kind of to your question earlier, Valerie, like it only got darker. Like, that was the thing, is as I was writing, it was like it only got darker and more violent and scarier. But please read it. I don't know, it's like a terrible ending. But yeah, it was definitely, it had its rewarding moments, and I think adding some lightness was important, but it was definitely a hard project to stick through for the whole time.
It's a real achievement, Willa. And for anybody who hasn't read it yet, I totally recommend it. And it's not that violent. I mean, it's just that there's these little sparks of violence that surprise you, like where you wouldn't have expected it to come. It's not like there's a lot of gory violence throughout. It's not like that. It's a beautiful, like beautifully artfully written book. And it's a huge achievement, Willa. I'm super happy for you and proud of you. And I'm so glad that you put this book into the world because we really needed it.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I can't, like, all the kind words. It's like very overwhelming. And I honestly, I really couldn't have done it without you. And I think it was really crucial that I'm so happy I ended up at UWM and you got to read it and help me with the book. And it wouldn't be what it is today if I didn't have you as an advisor. So so grateful. And also, there's so many people here, and that's so exciting.
Oh, I know. There's this really sweet message from one of your former teachers. There's like a lot of really sweet messages you have to check out.
That is so funny. That's amazing.
So welcome back, Daniel. You can take it from here if you'd like.
Thank you so much. Congratulations.
Thank you, everyone.
Launch. And thank you all for coming to our event. Hope to see you at another. You've got a link at the top to purchase. And don't forget, you can click on that link, or maybe Valerie's link, or Garth Greenwell's essay, and they will still be there in another window when this event closes down. So click now. I'm going to give you 3 seconds to do that. 1, 2, 3. And now you can all watch the game. So
go Bucks!
Go Bucks!
You're the deer.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Daniel, too.